Gertrude Stein, Edith Wharton, and T.S. Eliot. And the amazing thing is about these letters is that each one sounds exactly like you're reading a Gertrude Stein novel, a T.S. Eliot poem, or a Edith Wharton novel. It's just their tone in their letters are exactly how they write. So the first one is from Gertrude Stein. Wearing distance glasses is not a good thing to read.
There you go.
That's for being short-sighted. This is for being long-sighted. Okay, now the first time I read this out loud, it's the repetitive words. I mean, she uses comfort and pleasure and good, and if you start reading it, you start to understand Stein and the way she writes.
Absolutely.
It's fascinating. And really not until this third time that I read it
Yeah.
out loud. Did you get it?
Well, you're plugged into it.
Yeah.
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 You're on the same, it's on the same melody.
Yeah, fascinating. A rose is a rose is a rose. Oh, and this is so interesting. I just found her PS. It's on the next page at the top of, because everybody very politely asks about Mrs. Fitzgerald, and she says, I have left hardly space to ask if you and Mrs. Fitzgerald won't come up to lunch or tea someday this week. Do call me up. I didn't, and she always, and Stein, if you notice, always uses we. It means her and Toklas, but she never mentions Alice by name. I found this morning and I read it to Donald. It's about 5 minutes,
Yeah.
but it's really. Well, let's give a little introduction.
Just give the context, it's obviously in response.
Yes, obviously Fitzgerald sent a criticism to Tom Wolfe of something he'd written. And this is July 26, 1937, and I think he answered immediately. And he's somewhat put out by the criticism, but he explains himself and explains why.
As Tom Wolfe would, and he didn't censor or edit it.
And just as an aside for those of you who know, and of course everybody knows, including Marie, the only one who doesn't is Tim, but he will. Donald introduced Travis to Thomas Wolfe, and he read aloud from
You can't go home again.
You Can't Go Home Again for many, many, many weeks in class. I think it had an enormous effect on his writing, and you can hear it in here. So just an aside.
Sure,
Yeah.
yeah.
I'm gonna write Travis about this. Gregory Rabassa died, who was probably the most famous translator of Latin American literature in the world. He translated 100 Years of Solitude, and Gabriel Garcia Marquez actually shared his Nobel Prize with him when he accepted it. And probably the most revolutionary thing he did as a translator was just exactly what Donald's talking about. He understood what sound contributed to meaning of a word, and so he would choose one word over another because of the sound. Before the Saturday Group, for 10 years on Glenroy Avenue, there was a Latin American novel group that was led by my friend Joan, and she was a great expert in Latin American literature, and Rabassa was her favorite translator.
Yeah.
And then slowly but surely, the Saturday seminar crept in, and Mr. and Dr. Fogan right over here would creep up the front steps. We would overlap, and finally the Latin American group got pushed out. But we did 10 years of only the great Latin American novels. So we discovered this together this morning. It's a letter from Fitzgerald to Ernest Hemingway, and it made us feel like the camaraderie of the four of you. It's rare among writers, and it existed between the two of them. There's a writer's notebook in here which he kept. It goes on for about 200 pages. He was very organized, and I'll just so that you know what a writer like he did. I won't read the contents, but he organized sections, and I think it's very, very helpful.
It's interesting.
Yeah, how anyway, He wrote down snatches of conversations. He wrote down his feelings if that painting cost, and he had it all categorized so that he could use it when he needed it in a book.
Well, they cared, and they were aware of the Philistine culture in which they were writing, and they encouraged each other. And writing was all. Writing was all. I think Marie has that, and others of you now. Lance is getting is wrestling with this, and it's costing him with the end result in mind. Is too narcissistic. He was too handsome. He drank too much. His wife was too unstable. They were too provocative a couple. He allowed Hemingway to push him around. Why, there's no end to the criticism of Scott Fitzgerald. But The Great Gatsby is the #1 seller, and I think probably rightly so, in the 20th century. So that's uneven, or so is Tolstoy. I mean, these critics have to make a living too, and they sometimes confuse genius and creative work with some kind of predictability and smoothness, as in journalism or in essays or in history, and they see idiosyncrasies and they put it down to want them to change. Thus the letter Thomas Wolfe's answer and to Fitzgerald himself. Also, his obsession with youth and senescence, with youth and its opposite. It might have to be very old, but the passage of youth, the transitory glamour and power of it. So he talks about the new and the old, but the old Fitzgerald was new, and the new Fitzgerald is old. So there is a sort of a coursing between them, on the rails of memory, and he's able to evoke that in all his writings, whether it be letters or anything else. He's open. There's an openness in him. It would be called a frailty if he didn't have the talent and didn't tell stories. He might just be considered slightly unstable, handsome young man who drank too much.
This is after his first great success, looking back from a lifetime of many failures. But one was now a professional, and the new world couldn't possibly be presented without bumping into the old out of the way. One gradually developed a protective hardness against both praise and blame. Too often people like your things for the wrong reasons, or people like them who dislike would be a compliment. No decent career was ever founded on a public, and one learned to go ahead without precedence and without fear. Once, in the middle 20s, I was driving along the High Corniche. That's the road, right down the road here along the Riviera. Through the twilight, with the whole French Riviera twinkling on the sea below. As far ahead as I could see was Monte Carlo, and though it was out of season and there were no Grand Dukes left to gamble, and E. Phillips Oppenheim was a fat, industrious man in my hotel who lived in a bathrobe. The very name was so incorrigibly enchanting that I could only stop the car and, like the Chinese, whisper, "Ah me, ah me." It was not Monte Carlo I was looking at. It was way back into the mind of a young man with cardboard soles who had walked the streets of New York. I was him again, for an instant. I had the good fortune to share his dreams, I who had no more dreams of my own. And there are still times when I creep up on him, surprise him on an autumn morning in New York or on a spring night in Carolina, when it is so quiet that you can hear a dog barking in the next county. But never again as during that all too short period when he and I were one person, when the fulfilled future and the wistful past were mingled in a single gorgeous moment, when life was literally a dream.
Wow.